That night began like any other in rural Kentucky, with no warning signs and no sense of unease. 12 men finished work later than usual, the smell of damp wood still clinging to their shoulders, machine grease on their hands, their thoughts fixed only on the dinners waiting at home. Some promised their wives they would return early, some told their sons they would go fishing that weekend, and others simply longed to sit down, pull off their heavy boots, and sleep in peace. They climbed into the same old pickup truck, a familiar decision made without thought, riding together for convenience, for ease, just as they had done hundreds of times before. But that night, the truck never came back. The next morning, sunlight fell on empty driveways, lunchboxes still sat by the door, jackets hung untouched in their places. There were no phone calls, no messages, no sign that the 12 men still existed anywhere in the world. At first, the town tried to reassure itself. Perhaps the truck had broken down. Perhaps they had stayed somewhere overnight, but as the hours passed, a terrifying truth slowly emerged. 12 men had vanished at the same time, on the same night, in a place where everyone knew everyone's name, in a town where secrets rarely survived. And a question began to echo, one no one dared to ask aloud, not what happened, but what could possibly be big enough to make 12 men never return home. In the fall of 1985, in the eastern hills of Kentucky, the workday did not end when the sun went down. For loggers, daylight was only a relative limit. As long as the machines could still run, as long as the job was unfinished, they stayed. The rolling hills did not care about the clock, and neither did the men who had grown up among them. The 12 men on that shift were all accustomed to late nights. They were used to exhaustion seeping into every muscle, to the roar of engines drowning out thought, to coming home after dinner had gone cold, after children were already asleep, when their wives looked at them with quiet concern and unspoken affection. They were not strangers to this land. Most of them were born here, raised here, and could find their way home with their eyes closed. They knew every bend in the road, every steep incline, every red dirt turn that an outsider would never dare take without a guide. And they also knew about the hollow. It lay a few miles off the main road, hidden behind a bend that most people would pass without ever noticing. On a map, it barely existed. But to the locals, it was part of the town's collective memory. No one called it dangerous. But no one called it safe either. The rules there were never written down. There were no signs, no fences. They were passed on through half-finished sentences, through glances that lingered a moment too long, through voices lowered whenever someone mentioned its name. During the day, if you had to go, you went. At night, you stayed on the pavement. No one remembered when that rule began, maybe before electricity, maybe before pickup trucks. It existed as something self-evident, like the certainty that night would fall and the forest would grow quiet. That evening, after the work was finished, the flatbed truck was already waiting. It was old, loud, and so familiar it was nearly invisible. Flaking paint exposed dull metal beneath. Wooden rails warped from years of rain and sun. It was not the kind of vehicle anyone would look twice at, but it still ran. And for them that was enough. They split up as they always did. A few drove their own vehicles home. The rest climbed onto the truck bed, planning to ride together until they reached the main road, then branch off in different directions. No one objected. No one hesitated. It was routine, and routine has a quiet way of lowering a person's guard. None of them believed they were breaking any rule. They had passed through the area countless times in daylight. They were men of this land. They believed they understood it. As the truck began to roll, the last light of day slipped behind the ridgelines. The forest closed in on both sides of the road. The familiar sound of the engine echoed through the growing darkness. No one knew that, in that moment, they were entering a place where the unwritten rule was no longer a reminder, but a boundary. That night passed without anyone noticing anything unusual. In the mountains, coming home late was nothing new. Poor dirt roads, aging equipment, one small malfunction could keep a man out until well past dark. No one called the police. No one stood on a porch waiting in panic. Everything still fit within the limits of normal. Until morning came. Early sunlight fell over the scattered houses in the valley. Smoke should have been rising from kitchen chimneys. Engines should have been starting one by one in familiar rhythm. But in many driveways, there was nothing, only empty space. One wife woke, checked the clock, then looked outside. Her husband's truck was not there. She told herself he had probably stayed over at a coworker's place, too exhausted to drive home. It had happened before. She went back into the kitchen, set the coffee pot on the stove, and tried to keep the morning ordinary. In another house, a lunch box still sat neatly by the door. Inside was the meal prepared the night before, carefully wrapped, untouched. A child asked where his father was. The mother answered that he came home late, her voice calmer than the feeling tightening in her chest. At first, the assumptions were gentle. Maybe they had been reassigned somewhere else. Maybe the truck had broken down. Maybe they would call any minute now. But time passed, and the phones remained silent. Calls began to circulate, at first casual, checking in. Did he come home? Have you heard anything? People spoke in voices that tried to stay steady, but the more they talked, the more the worry surfaced. No one had received a call. No one had seen any of the 12 men since the night before. By mid-morning, the silence felt different. In a town where everyone knew each other's routines, where even an unfamiliar car would draw attention, the disappearance of 12 men at once could not be ignored. The wives began standing on their porches longer. They watched the road leading into town, hoping a familiar vehicle would appear. Every distant engine made their hearts jump, only to fall again when it passed by, carrying someone else. Promises from the night before began replaying in their minds with painful clarity. Fixing the fence, taking the kids fishing, attending church together on Sunday morning. Small, ordinary promises, now heavy because they remained unfulfilled. By then, the worry no longer stayed contained within individual homes. It spread outward through more urgent phone calls, through exchanged looks on the street, through the shared sense that something had slipped off the town's familiar course. These were not men who disappeared without a word. They did not abandon their families. They did not walk away from their jobs. And they certainly did not leave everything behind all at once. As morning faded toward noon, a cold truth began to take shape, even though no one dared speak it aloud. The night before had not simply been a late return. It was the last night the 12 men were ever seen. The first call reached the county sheriff's office just before noon. There was no hysterical screaming, only a wife forcing her voice to stay calm as she explained that her husband hadn't come home after the night shift, and that several other men hadn't either. The deputy on duty took careful notes. 12 men. A flatbed truck. Last known location, the hollow off the main road. The details sat side by side on the page, but at that moment, they still did not form a terrifying picture. In this part of the state, reports like that weren't rare. A breakdown in the woods, a detour, spending the night at a friend's place. And sometimes, a vehicle would vanish for a while and reappear somewhere else intact, or close to it. The report was filed under a simple assumption: possible vehicle theft, with missing persons attached. There were no sirens, no search party dispatched immediately. Everything moved at the slow, familiar pace of a small office where every case had to wait its turn. The deputy made a few calls. No overnight crash reports. No fires. No hospital had admitted anyone matching the descriptions. The more he checked, the emptier the picture became. And that emptiness, for the moment, created a false sense of relief. No bad news could mean nothing bad had happened yet. Outside the station, families began to gather. They repeated the same stories, turning over every small detail from the night before: who said what, who stood next to whom, who climbed into the truck last. But the more they remembered, the more they realized that nothing about that evening had felt unusual. It wasn't until late afternoon that the sheriff's office sent 2 deputies to check the hollow. They drove along the dirt road the logging crew used every day. The sun was low now, light filtering through the trees in long bands across the ground. They stopped, looked around, listened. No broken glass, no skid marks, no signs of struggle. The forest was quiet, like any other evening. Birds still called. Wind still moved through the leaves. They didn't go deeper. Night was coming, and in their minds this still wasn't a crime scene, just a place that needed a quick look for the sake of procedure. Their report was brief: nothing found, no conclusion. They turned back as dusk began to settle. They didn't know that decision leaving the dirt road, while there was still a trace of light, would later be mentioned more than any other detail of that day. In internal reports, in private conversations, in sleepless nights spent wondering what might have happened if they had gone a few hundred yards farther. A second night fell over the town under the weight of waiting. No official statement, no answers, only the feeling that somewhere, time was moving far too fast. And while the clock continued to run, those 12 men were still out there in a place where delay, even by a few hours, could change everything. By the second morning, the atmosphere in town had shifted. The first night's vague waiting was gone, along with the gentle attempts at reassurance. In its place was a heavy pressure, as if someone had set an invisible stone on every family's chest. Those men were not the type to stay gone. They didn't leave their phones dead for hours. They didn't abandon work, family, responsibility. And they certainly didn't vanish together, no message, no sign, no one seeing a single one of them. From early morning, their coworkers began arriving at the sheriff's office. No appointments, no coordination. They simply knew that if they waited any longer, things would get worse. Men who usually stood shoulder to shoulder in the woods now stood in a cramped waiting room, hats in their hands, worry written plainly across their faces. They said what the families had been thinking since the night before. 12 men don't just disappear like this. A truck full of equipment doesn't get abandoned without anyone reporting it. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The case was upgraded. Each name was recorded separately. Ages ranged from men barely in their 20s to those nearly 60. Some were fathers of children not yet in school. Some were already grandfathers. These weren't anonymous names. These were familiar faces, part of the town itself. Search and rescue was contacted, but it was the busy season.
Harvest farms.
Lives. Help arrived slowly in small waves. Police returned to the hollow. This time they searched more thoroughly, walking the forest edge, checking ravines, peering into dry creek beds. But the terrain did not help them. Dry leaves carpeted the ground, swallowing footprints. The soil was rough and gave no clean impressions. Wind moved through. Animals crossed. Time quietly erased whatever might have been left from the night before. No blood, no shell casings, no drop tools, no sign that 12 men had panicked here, had run, had fought. The absence of evidence began to mean something else. It stopped feeling like luck. It became frightening. In private discussions, deputies began to consider possibilities. They did not want to speak aloud to the families. An accident, a violent confrontation, something worse. Something that did not leave easy traces. But without a clear scene, without a true starting point, every theory floated unanchored, unable to settle anywhere. Outside, the families kept waiting. Some never left the phone. Some sat at windows for hours. Some began driving the familiar roads, calling names into the trees, even though they knew the chances of an answer were nearly nothing. The waiting stretched on, and in that emptiness, fear sharpened into something colder. Not fear that they were lost, but fear that there was a reason there was nothing left to find. On the third morning, everything changed. No one had to say it. Everyone could feel it. The air in the search team was heavier, quieter. Eyes avoided meeting, as if everyone was preparing for something they did not want to face. It had rained the night before, not much, but enough to soften the dirt roads leading into the hollow. At first light, strange tire marks began to appear, not belonging to any of the logging crew's familiar routes. They were faint, but for people who had lived here all their lives, it was enough to know something had happened. This time they didn't drive deep into the woods. They walked slowly, carefully, as if one wrong step could erase the last surviving clue. The hollow narrowed as they went in. Trees thickened. The ground broke into sudden drops you only noticed when you were close. The sound felt wrong. Voices didn't carry. Radios cut in and out. It felt as if the forest was swallowing everything. The first discovery came quietly. No screams. No sudden rush. A volunteer stopped, stood still a moment too long, then raised a hand. Not far ahead, behind low brush, a body lay motionless, a man. Alone. Not near the road. Not near where the truck should have stopped. His posture wasn't the posture of a fall. It was the posture of a body that could not go any farther. When police sealed off the area, people still hoped desperately that the others were nearby, that it had been an accident. that they would be found together. They were wrong. Within the next hour, more bodies were found, not side by side, not arranged in any pattern that made sense. One behind a limestone boulder, one near a dry channel, one higher up, as if he had been trying to climb out. The distances between them froze everyone in place. This had not happened at a single point. This was a chain of events stretched across time and space. There were signs they had moved after being hurt. Broken branches. Disturbed leaves forming narrow paths through the trees. A boot was found far from its owner's body, as if he had run or been forced to run before he collapsed. The hollow, once considered simply a place to avoid at night, now revealed itself as a place of pursuit. As the number of bodies rose, the truth became unavoidable. These men did not die at the same moment. They did not die the same way. Some died fast. Others lived for hours. Some carried wounds that if they had been near a hospital might not have killed them at all. But here, deep in the woods, with night falling and no way out, those wounds became a slow sentence. People didn't speak much. Those searching began to understand they weren't just finding coworkers, friends, neighbors. They were gathering pieces of a horrifying night, one in which 12 men had been separated, hunted, and left in the dark. When the last body was found, the hollow fell silent again. But it was no longer the familiar silence of the mountains. It was a silence weighted with breath held back as if the place itself was keeping what it had witnessed. And in that moment, everyone understood. They hadn't come to find survivors. They had come too late to see what the hollow had decided not to return. When the first shock faded, the scene began to speak in its own way, not with words, but with detail. Small, cold details that forced everyone present to reconsider every earlier assumption. Technicians entered the area carefully. They were no longer searching for bodies. They were searching for answers. And the more they saw, the worse the picture became. The first shell casings were marked, then more, but they didn't match. Different calibers, different shapes. That meant more than one gun had been used in the hollow that night, maybe two, maybe more. Not a single gun was found. That absence was as heavy as the casings themselves. It said something clearly. Whoever did this did not flee in panic. They knew what to take with them, and they did. As wounds were documented, the story grew more complex. Some men had been shot at very close range, in the back of the head or neck, clean shots, decisive, without hesitation. Others had defensive wounds, arms raised, grazes on shoulders or forearms, as if they had tried to shield themselves in their final seconds. Some had been shot while moving. The angles suggested they had been running or trying to. Another man showed blunt force trauma, inflicted after he had already been badly wounded, indicating the violence did not happen in a single instant. The medical examiner began offering early estimates. Times of death did not align. Some died almost immediately. Others lived for hours. Some were gravely wounded but did not die until blood loss, exhaustion, or cold finished what the bullets began. That thought made the people standing there imagine things they didn't want to imagine. A long night, fear stretched across hours, knowing you were being hunted but having nowhere to run. When investigators mapped body locations, a pattern began to appear. The placements were not random. The distances, movement directions, stopping points, everything suggested control. Someone had directed the flow of events. Someone had pushed them into separate paths. Someone had decided who would live a little longer, and who would not. The hollow's terrain became the most important witness of all: steep drops hidden under dry leaves, rock cuts that swallowed sound, high points where someone could see without being seen. This was not a place a stranger could exploit in the dark. Whoever did this knew the land. They knew where someone would stumble. They knew which route looked like escape but was actually a trap. They knew that at night, the forest would side with the one who belonged to it. In private conversations, a conclusion began to form, though no one wanted to say it too soon. This was not random. Not an argument gone too far, and certainly not an accident. This was organized, planned, involving multiple people, and most of all driven by a purpose big enough to make 12 lives an acceptable price. When night fell again over the hollow, investigators left with the same thought pressing down on them. The most terrifying thing wasn't what had happened, but the certainty that the people responsible had walked away in order, in silence, convinced they would never be named. After the bodies were taken out of the hollow, the town did not erupt the way people might expect. There were no screams, no chaos. Only a strange, quiet shift, as if someone had turned down the volume of an entire community. Funerals followed one after another. The church was packed, every seat taken. Men stood silently at the back, hats pressed to their chests. Women held each other and cried, yet their eyes kept sliding toward the doors, as if afraid someone might enter at the wrong moment. Life continued. Shops stayed open. Coffee was poured. But investigators quickly sensed that something had changed. When they asked questions, the answers were still polite, still soft, just shorter, vaguer, thinner on detail. When the questions touched the hollow, voices dropped. Eyes drifted away. Some people cut their stories off mid-sentence, as if realizing they had already said too much. No one said they were afraid. But fear showed in the careful choice of words, in the long silences between answers. Then rumors started, slow, persistent. Strange vehicles at night. Men who didn't drink in town, didn't stay long, didn't talk. Dirt roads used only after dark. No one confirmed it. No one denied it either. A few days later, a man came forward. He didn't go directly to the sheriff's office. He asked a mutual acquaintance to arrange a private meeting. He said he had seen the truck that night, moving slowly along a road that didn't lead home. He said there were men near it, not dressed like loggers, armed, alert. His account matched details investigators were assembling: timing, direction, the sense that something was deeply wrong. For the first time, it felt like there was light. Then 2 days later he retracted everything. He called back, voice tight, and said he had been mistaken. It was dark. The light was bad. He wasn't sure it was the truck. He wasn't sure what he saw was real. When asked why he changed his story so quickly, he went silent for a long moment, then said, simply, "I'm scared for my family." There were no recorded threats, no texts, no calls. But in a small town, sometimes nothing needs to be said. Sometimes people only need to understand the consequences. From then on, cooperation dropped sharply. Some people asked for lawyers. Some were never home when deputies stopped by. A few moved away without telling anyone, and then the truck appeared. It was found in another county, on an abandoned road few people still used. What remained was only a burned black frame, wood reduced to ash. The cab twisted. The fire didn't look accidental. It was hot. Even. Intentional. Investigators immediately noticed what wasn't there: no tools, no personal items, no identifying traces. The truck had been cleaned out before it was burned. That wasn't panic. That was someone who knew exactly what needed to be erased. When word of the burned truck spread, the town's silence grew thicker. People asked fewer questions. No one argued in public. As if an invisible line had been drawn. 12 men were dead. And the living understood that to keep living, some things were better left unspoken. Years passed. The case slipped off the front pages not because it was solved, but because it stopped moving. Files were shelved. Investigators reassigned. The hollow returned to its familiar quiet, as if it had never witnessed anything at all. But time, even slowly, has its own way of exposing what was buried. The break came from something no one expected: a land dispute that sent a survey team into the woods near the hollow, along the edge of an area that had been searched but never thoroughly dug. They weren't looking for evidence. They were measuring. But that accident of circumstance opened what decades of investigation had not touched. Beneath shallow soil, they found rusted metal fragments, not rock, not roots, but something manufactured and destroyed. Police were called. Then state police. Then federal people who still remembered the case number. A small excavation revealed a heavy truth gun, fragments bent, smashed, broken. Buried quickly, but with intent. Mixed among them were personal items once reported missing: a watch face, a belt buckle, small things, but enough for families to recognize instantly. The burial site was not random. It sat along a route leading out of the hollow, as if someone had stopped there long enough to decide those items were too dangerous to carry. This time, science favored the truth. New forensic methods allowed reconstruction of fragments, comparison of manufacturing marks. The results pointed toward 2 names that had appeared in old files: questioned, suspected. Both were dead. The truth arrived late, so late there was no one left to charge. But that wasn't all. When investigators revisited old photos of the burned truck, they looked with different eyes. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a structure. Strange welds. Reinforcement plates that weren't part of the original design. A hidden cavity beneath the bed. The truck hadn't been used only to haul timber. It had been modified. In the 1980s, remote forest roads were ideal routes for stolen goods, weapons, and things that never appeared on paperwork. An old, filthy truck known to locals, overlooked by strangers, was perfect camouflage. And then, on the wrong night, 12 loggers drove that truck onto a road not meant for them. They weren't targets because of who they were. They became targets because they saw what they weren't allowed to see. To the people behind that operation, the truck's sudden appearance was a threat. And in a world run on silence, threats aren't handled with warnings. They are erased. As the truth surfaced, the town's silence gained a different meaning. People hadn't been protecting murderers out of loyalty. They had been living beside a system big enough, ruthless enough, to make 12 lives an acceptable price. And they knew there are truths you can speak only once, because after that, there's no way back. In the end, the case did not close with a trial. There was no defendant standing before a judge, no sentence read aloud, no moment the families could exhale and say justice had finally arrived. The file was updated one last time in cautious language: indicators of organized crime, indirect evidence, motive, but no one left to prosecute. No legal path strong enough to continue. The case was not unsolved. The truth had been touched. But it was unresolved, not settled in the way people need in order to heal. For the families, the truth came too late. They learned why their husbands never came home, why the father of their children never walked through the door again. But knowing was not the same as justice. It only gave the pain a sharper shape. Those men did not die because of their own mistakes. They weren't looking for trouble. They were working. They just wanted to go home. And in an ordinary night, they crossed an invisible boundary no one warned them about. The town went on. Shops stayed open. Schools welcomed children each morning. But something had changed forever. People spoke less, asked less, and learned to avoid certain roads after dark. The hollow remained there between the hills, no signs, no memorial. Only trees growing thicker with each passing year. But memory did not vanish. It lived in the avoided glances, the unfinished stories, the warnings never fully explained. For the investigators who worked it back then, the case became a scar not because of what they failed to find, but because of what they sensed and could not bring into the light in time. And for anyone listening to this story, the most haunting thing is not only that 12 men died. It's that an entire system, people, terrain, fear, and silence, worked together perfectly to let it happen, and then kept existing as if nothing had happened at all. Some crimes don't disappear because no one knows. They disappear because too many people know and understand that silence is the only way to survive. And that is why, even after the truth was reached, this case remained a wound that never truly closed.